The Romans have a gift for somehow beating all odds. When the empire was in crisis in the 3rd, 7th, and 13th century, it somehow managed to stay together and eventually rebuild itself. But it's one thing to hear about it, and it's another to live it. Manuel was now the man everyone was looking to for guidance, following Mehmed's sack of Constantinople. In a hastily assembled committee, Manuel met with the governors of each theme. The meeting was nothing short of chaotic. Men threw insults, jabs, and threats at each other. They demanded concessions, and some wanted to pass down their themes to their families, as Vitrinus had done with Manuel. But none wanted the actual job or responsibilities of being Roman emperor, fearing what happened to Vitrinus would happen to them. Manuel was forced to temporarily acquiesce to the governor's demands, knowing that the last thing the empire needed was a civil war. However, he needed something from the governors first. He wanted complete and total loyalty to him and his family only. Gregorius be damned. When asked why by one of his governors, Manuel didn't hold back and condemned the actions of Gregorius, calling him a man worse than Lucas Notaras, who was willing to bully the nobility and good Roman citizens. He warned the nobles in the meeting that should Gregorius come to power, there was no ensuring their safety in his regime. That was enough to sway the majority of the nobility to his side. In a hastily put together ceremony, Manuel was crowned Roman emperor in some church in Thessaloniki. There was no fanfare, no celebrations of any kind. In a way, it mirrored Constantine Palaiologos' coronation. Coincidentally, on the day of Manuel's coronation, the sky darkened, looking as if there was a storm coming, but nothing happened. No rain or thunder. Manuel set out of Thessaloniki in late June of 1480 and marched his army all the way to the Maritsa River. Once there, the army was told to stop and set up camp. Unlike Vitrinus, Manuel was not really used to campaigning. The life of a soldier was something he could not get used to. The only reason his men followed and respected him was due to his father's legacy as a great soldier and loyal ally to Constantine Palaiologos and Vitrinus. For a few days, the armies of Greece sat there, encamped, waiting for Manuel's next order. After some deliberation, Manuel eventually ordered the army to move out to Arcadiopolis, knowing that retaking the barracks of the lost Constantinian army would slightly improve the morale of his men. When the armies arrived outside of Arcadiopolis, they were welcomed with open arms by the few dozen men who remained in their posts. The soldiers told Manuel that upon hearing the news of Vitrinus' execution in Constantinople, many stationed in Arcadiopolis either deserted or defected. Those that defected were now serving a man in Constantinople, who was declared the legitimate Roman emperor by the Ottomans, a man named Makarios Elias. Not only that, but there was a large Ottoman army stationed in Galata, who were tasked with overseeing the reconstruction and modifications of the Theodosian walls. That last part had Manuel weak in the knees. Even though Mehmed II had no plans of turning Constantinople into the capital of the Ottoman Empire, he still knew of its value and importance in the region. He planned to turn Constantinople into a city and a fortress, a rendezvous for future Ottoman armies on their way to and from Anatolia. Should the Ottomans complete such an ambitious project, there was no stopping the inevitable fall of the Roman Empire. Manuel made the decision to go to Constantinople and begin a siege of the city, hoping to catch the Ottomans off guard and kick them out of Greece. The soldiers were weary of Manuel's approach, and reluctantly joined him on his march, feeling uneasy about potentially facing Mehmed II in battle. Manuel would address their concerns and called Mehmed's victory a fluke. Citing the Sultan's ambush of Nicaea as cowardly, he reminded them of their father's victory in Lamia, and the amount of courage it took for the Roman army to stand their ground against a man like Skanderbeg. Manuel's words of encouragement won over his soldiers, and they continued their march to Constantinople. Once outside the city, they were approached by men who represented Makarios' court. They implored Manuel to give up his claim as Roman emperor, and offered to give him a vast amount of money to do so. Manuel didn't see the point in negotiating with the enemy, so he shooed them away, telling them that he'd only negotiate with Mehmed II and not some nobody who was emperor of a few houses in Constantinople. However, no matter how many times Manuel shooed Macarius' envoys away, they'd always come back with more terms of truce, some of them benefiting Manuel more than Macarius. Eventually, Manuel became open to talks of peace, seeing an opportunity to potentially turn Macarius' court against the Ottomans. For a few days, both sides went back and forth, trying to come up with terms of peace. Or so Manuel thought. Macarius, upon seeing Manuel's army, called for the Ottoman army in Galata to man the walls in Constantinople, and also called for Mehmed himself. Mehmed couldn't make it, however, instead sending Macarius 8,000 Karamanid and Ankayonlu soldiers in his place. This was more than enough for him, though, and he immediately cut off talks of peace. While Manuel and his men were encamped outside the walls, Macarius had the Ottoman soldiers raid and attack the Roman camp. In the chaos, Manuel was injured but managed to get on his feet, and coordinated an organized retreat, which held off Ottoman horsemen. Those who were unfortunate enough to have stayed behind at the camp were put to the sword and their bodies were thrown into the Golden Horn. This defeat severely demoralized the armies of Greece, and many wanted to return home and go back to their families. But Manuel insisted that they continue the fight and prevent the Ottomans from establishing a foothold in Greece. One of his commanders just stared at him blankly and said, "We've already lost Greece. It's only a matter of time before they come for our remaining cities." The lack of belief in the soldiers destroyed Manuel. If the army didn't believe they could win a fight against the Ottomans, there truly was no hope left. Manuel returned to Thessaloniki and retreated back into his headquarters. How could he even fix this problem? Was there anything he could do to revitalize the Roman army? Was there anything that could be done at all? Should he just give up? These questions filled Manuel's head and kept him up at night. Manuel's guards entered his bedchambers and told him of a man requesting to see him. Confused, Manuel followed his guards and saw the man before him was none other than the disgraced Lorisan, Gregorius. "Throw him out of here." "No, wait, I can help you. I can help you with the army." "Help?" "Like how you offered to help me with the Bulgarian problem." "Look, I was wrong in that approach, I'll admit that. But if you let me instruct them, teach them, they will come out even stronger than before." "You're desperate, aren't you?" "Just give me 1 year to train the soldiers, and you'll see results." Manuel interrupted Gregorius and had his guards storm out of the governor headquarters. As they tossed Gregorius to the street, Manuel would yell out that should he return to Thessaloniki, he'd be a dead man. Gregorius watched Manuel and his guards go back inside, his eyes filled with resentment. He had just offered to work for him, and whip the army back into shape, but the man who stole what was his tossed him aside. Gregorius walked out of Thessaloniki and made his way back to Larissa, where his entourage was waiting for him. He told him that there was no chance of getting back into the army, and told him to just go home, saying he'd find a way eventually. He went to a local tavern and drank his sorrows away, having become a regular there. If he couldn't even be in the army or any position in power, he'd never be able to get back at those whom he deemed responsible for his life's woes. He lamented over his thoughts for a while and started to question himself. What really was his goal in life? Was it to punish people for not having helped him when he was a child? Why was he still so caught up in something that happened so long ago? For God's sake, she's been dead for years! Gregorius hurled his spear towards the wall, the glass shattering upon impact. Tears streamed down his face. For the first time in decades, his feelings were genuine, and he was powerless to do anything about it. No one to lie to, no one to trust. He was alone. While crying, Gregorius felt a hand slide from his left shoulder to his right. He looked up and saw a woman looking over him. Her face showed compassion, and she sat down next to him, asking him what was wrong. He could have lied to her, told a woman some BS to get her to leave him alone. But her mere presence made Gregorius feel at ease, a feeling that had long left him ever since the death of his sister and aunt. He opened up to the strange woman and let everything out, from his mother's murder of his sister, to his disdain of religion. He confessed his indifference to the common people's needs and his need to have power over them. The strange woman did not judge him, though, nor did she hold any ill will towards Gregorius for his beliefs. She held Gregorius in her arms and assured him that what he was feeling was valid. She gave him something no one had ever tried to give him: validation. She agreed with his stance on humanity and told him that she too was a misanthrope and wanted nothing more than to change the evil ways of man, even if it meant stooping down to the level of those they were trying to change. The woman caressed Gregorius' face and told him not to give up, that even in his loneliest moments, he'd have her. Gregorius asked the woman for her name, and she got up and motioned for him to do the same.
My name is Catherine. You may not know me, but I know you. I'm here to make sure you do what you were meant to do, and not waste your life here in this tavern.
Gregorius looked at Catherine, bewildered.
When you're done with your life's work, I will come to you. I'll also bring someone with me. Someone you know.
Catherine smiled and looked at something behind Gregorius. Instinctively, he turned around to see what she was looking at, and saw her. There was no doubt in his mind. It was Claudia, his sister. He approached her and tried to hug her, but she vanished in his arms. He fell to his knees and looked back at Catherine, but she too was gone. In her place was a cross on the ground, carved with the initials GV, from his name. He looked around and saw that the tavern was completely empty and stepped outside, only to be met with the breeze that gently nudged him north, away from Larissa. Gregorius would leave Greece by the end of the year and depart on a mission that would change the course of his life and that of thousands. During his trip, he'd come to wonder about what would have been if he'd chosen to stay at the tavern and to go against Catherine, but preferred not to think about it, content in the idea that she'd one day return with Claudia by her side. The Sultan has been sick for a while, Bayezid. We can't let you go near him. He might spread whatever he has to you. That is my father. I demand to see him. Bayezid, please. You can't go in there. 2 doctors we've sent in have already passed away from brief contact with your father. We can't risk your health for that. Bayezid nodded begrudgingly and sat down in the hallway. What has gotten you ill, father? Mehmed laid in his bedchambers, coughing his lungs out due to a sudden but aggressive illness. An illness that in the first few days saw Mehmed vomiting excessively, to the point of blood spewing out of his mouth. His physicians had no remedies for the illness, nor did Mehmed have many physicians to try and treat him, since they'd all end up catching his sickness and dying immediately after. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire laid there, miserable, and longing for death to take him. However, death would not answer his call, but a woman. Catherine. She sat by Mehmed's windowsill and watched over him as his body continued to deteriorate. She said nothing to him at first, almost as if she was waiting for Mehmed to speak to her first. Eventually the pain became too much for him to handle, and he begged her to do something. She had managed to somehow grant his armies victory in battle, and wanted her to perform a miracle on him, but she stood there, staring. Enjoying this, aren't you? You sick, twisted woman. Should have killed you when I had the chance. I don't know why I trusted you. Catherine grinned, amused by the Sultan's threats.
Sleep now, Sultan. You don't have much time left.
Catherine covered Mehmed's mouth with a strange device that put him to sleep instantaneously. She crouched down and whispered to his ear.
You could have lived longer. Longer than you did originally. But you crossed me, and for that, I must put you to sleep. Like the sick, twisted man you are.
Catherine got up and watched the Sultan draw his last breath, content that she had ultimately cured Mehmed of his illness by giving him death.
Vanity of vanities. all is vanity.
The year is now 1481. Mehmed II had passed away from a stronger variant of the bubonic plague, and his body was sent over to Baghdad for a proper funeral procession. Bayezid, supported by Karamani Mehmed Pasha, was elevated as the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and sought to assert his control of the realm by getting rid of his brother, Shem, who took up arms against Bayezid with the support of the easternmost provinces and cities. The Ottoman Empire was to face a round of civil war, while the Romans kept a watchful eye of the situation. Back in Greece, Macarius was able to take Arkediopolis unopposed. Roman outposts near the area had been deserted yet again, and Adrianople was left exposed to Macarius' army, who in a swift siege took the city, dealing a humiliating blow to Manuel and his court for having done nothing to stop him. In Thessaloniki, Manuel was fuming with anger. He took the army of Thessaloniki and Athens with him to confront Macarius' forces in open battle. They marched to Arkediopolis and put it under siege, waiting for Macarius to act, and hopefully engage in battle. He got what he hoped for, but in all the wrong ways. Macarius arrived outside of Arkediopolis around dusk and let a portion of his army engage the Romans in battle, while another began lighting torches and causing a ruckus. Macarius and a detachment of his Turkish cavalry managed to loop around the Roman army and began harassing the rear, making the Romans think that they had been encircled by another army. Manuel's men broke rank and routed. He was forced to cross back into friendly territory, across the Maritsa, and recuperated his losses by levying local peasants into his army, promising to have them back home by the end of the year. The peasants were told by survivors of the previous battle that it wasn't worth it, and advised them to go home back to their families, which made Manuel go berserk. He had a man named Ammonius flogged, as he was one of said people telling the peasants to leave the army. Ammonius's peers begged Manuel to stop his torture, but he straight up dismissed them and kicked them out of the army without being paid. The spur-of-the-moment decision seemed to have quelled talks of desertion, but back in Athens, this act would be seen as insulting, as Ammonius was popular in the city amongst its nobility and people. They'd call for the release of Ammonius and his exoneration, but after their pleas fell on deaf ears, the entire theme would rise up in rebellion. Manuel tried to diplomatically solve the issue by handing Ammonius over to the rebels, but this only emboldened them, resulting in the elevation of Ammonius as emperor. The revolt would take Manuel a year to settle, but even then, despite having the ringleaders executed, one man would get away, being Isaac Melotus, who fled to Macarius' court. Manuel would reorganize the themes following the revolt, hoping to thwart any future uprisings by adding an absurd amount of provinces one would need to get under control to pose any real threat to the emperor. Turning his attention back to Macarius, Manuel decided to put his pride aside and traveled to Bulgaria, where he met with Demo, asking for an alliance between both empires, at least until the Ottoman puppet issue was resolved. Upon hearing of Manuel's offer, Demo laughed hysterically at his face and had the news of Manuel's begging spread across Bulgaria, where he was now seen as a laughingstock. Manuel and his entourage made their way back to Thessaloniki in shame, and Manuel was above all pissed about the state the empire was in, thinking, things can't possibly go worse. When they got to Thessaloniki, they saw Venetian warships docked in the harbor. They asked for an audience with Manuel and arranged to meet at the docks. Once there, Gregorius was thrown before him, shackled. They handed him over to Manuel's custody and asked him if they could talk somewhere else. He agreed, but let them know he had something to take care of first, advising the Venetians to make themselves comfortable. Manuel personally led the interrogation of Gregorius, asking him what the hell he had done to get captured by the Venetians. Gregorius talked and revealed that he had traveled to Hungary and various courts of European monarchs, asking for help in a crusade. For his insolence, Manuel beat Gregorius repeatedly, having his guards hold him up after hours of torture left the Larissan incapable of standing on his own. He was careful enough not to beat him to death, preferring to throw him in the oubliette and having him die alone. In a meeting with the Venetian diplomats, Manuel was informed of the deal Gregorius had made with them, and they told him that he was expected to honor it. One of Manuel's nobles got up to protest the demand, yelling profanities at the diplomats and telling them to bring it. In response, one of the Venetians said, "We took Constantinople and Thessalonica once. What makes you think we can't do it again?" Clenching his fist, Manuel agreed. He told the diplomats that he needed some time to muster the diplomatic armies, and gave them an estimated time before returning back to his headquarters. Any peace he might have found upon returning home was interrupted by a delegation of various soldiers who wanted to meet with Manuel regarding the crusade Gregorius had convinced them to join. French, Hungarian, Wallachian, Genoese, and Serbian soldiers waited outside Thessaloniki, numbering in the thousands, requesting food and supplies for their men. To Manuel's surprise, the West actually came through with their request for aid, but now he had to accommodate the crusading armies on their way to Anatolia, and he had to get the armies moving fast before they turned restless. Manuel went out to greet the armies and assured them that they'd get moving soon. He met with various commanders of the armies, and they fleshed out plans about the crusade targets, who would be in charge, and what routes would be taken on their journey. The Hungarian captain, Sultan, listened intently, and once Manuel was finished talking, he asked the one question all crusading commanders had. Where was Gregorius? Manuel was taken aback by the question, and reassured them the crusade could be done without him, and tried to get back on point. But Sultan stood up and slammed his fist on the table, asking where Gregorius was. Manuel's bodyguards unsheathed their swords, and the situation quickly escalated, with the commanders calling for their bodyguards stationed outside. The French captain, Reuben, threw his sword onto the table, and ordered the other captains to do the same. Sultan, glancing at Manuel, then Reuben, obliged, and the others followed. Reuben spoke to Manuel, saying that Gregorius was agreed on to lead the crusading armies during their talks the months prior. Manuel tried explaining that Gregorius wasn't authorized to speak on his behalf, and what he promised them was with them, not him. Sultan had his arms crossed and nodded aggressively, but kept his composure, telling Manuel that if the agreements weren't honored, the Hungarians would walk. Hearing this, the Serbians also pledged that they would walk too, and a domino effect began, with the captains making their points clear that without Gregorius, there was no crusade. Manuel stood quiet, contemplating his decision. He frowned but agreed nonetheless. Manuel and few of his guards walked towards Gregorius' prison cell. There they found him sitting up against the wall, waiting. He looked up to see his would-be tormentors and grinned, seeing Reuben and his men behind Manuel. Manuel was disgusted at the sight of his smirk, and ordered he lead the crusading armies, but warned that a watchful eye would be kept on him at all times. Gregorius jovially nodded and stood up, receiving some armor from Manuel's bodyguards. As Gregorius was escorted out by Reuben, Manuel chose to stay behind, and looked around, scratching his beard and rubbing his neck. His eye twitched and he threw his crown onto the ground, kicking it repeatedly. Emperor of the Romans. The position was bullshit, he thought. In contrast to Manuel's fury, Gregorius was smug, and happily greeted the Crusade's captains, being welcomed into their camp by them, and spent the time drinking. The 10th Crusade was here, and about to take on the Ottomans and the Roman puppet state, ready for the journey ahead of them.